Captain William Bill Morrison's weathered hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone at the podium. The packed auditorium of the Denver Community Center fell silent, 200 faces staring up at him with expectation. News cameras rolled. His wife, Sarah, sat in the front row, her eyes filled with both pride and worry. After 28 years of carrying this burden, the moment had finally come. 25 years ago, Bill began, his voice cracking slightly, I made the worst decision of my career. I destroyed a good man's life to save my own skin. And that man, Officer Daniel Rodriguez, he's sitting right there in the third row. Every head in the auditorium turned. Daniel Rodriguez, now 53 with graying temples and deep lines around his eyes, sat perfectly still. His jaw was set, his dark eyes fixed on the man who had once been his captain, his mentor, his friend. Danny refused a direct order from me on November 15, 1988. I fired him for insubordination. For 25 years, I let the world believe he was just another dirty cop who couldn't follow the rules. Bill's voice grew stronger, steadier. But the truth is, Danny Rodriguez was the most honest cop I ever knew, and the order I gave him that night should have gotten us both thrown in prison. 3 years before that fateful November night, on a scorching August day in 1985, the August heat pressed down on Denver like a suffocating blanket, the temperature already climbing toward 95 degrees at 2:30 in the afternoon. Officer Daniel Rodriguez felt sweat gathering under his Kevlar vest as he stepped out of Patrol Car 247, the asphalt soft enough beneath his boots to leave impressions. The radio call had been routine. Domestic disturbance at 2247 Maple Street, neighbors reporting screaming and breaking glass, but something in the dispatcher's voice had caught his attention. Daniel was 26 years old, with 18 months on the Denver Police Department, and a reputation for being thorough, reliable, and unafraid of hard work. He'd grown up in the West Side barrio, the son of Mexican immigrants who had instilled in him a deep respect for education, hard work, and doing right by others. His father, Miguel, had worked construction for 30 years, sending both his sons to college on a laborer's wages and sheer determination. The house at 2247 Maple Street sat in a working-class neighborhood of small ranch homes with chain-link fences and struggling lawns. Daniel approached slowly, his trained eyes scanning for details that might indicate the nature of the disturbance. The front yard was neat, the grass recently mowed. A child's bicycle lay on its side near the front steps, but something felt wrong. "Rodriguez, wait up!" Daniel turned to see his partner, Officer William Morrison, jogging toward him from their second patrol car. At 34, Bill was 8 years older than Daniel, a 12-year veteran with steady nerves and the kind of street-smart instincts that came from working every kind of call the city could offer. He'd been divorced for 3 years, lived alone in a small apartment near downtown, and seemed to pour all his energy into the job. In the 6 months they'd been partnered together, Daniel had come to trust Morrison's judgment completely. Bill had a way of reading situations, of knowing when to be aggressive and when to show restraint. That had probably saved both their lives more than once. More importantly, Morrison treated his younger partner as an equal, never pulling rank or dismissing Daniel's observations because of his relative inexperience. "What's your gut telling you?" Morrison asked, unsnapping his holster as he approached. His weathered face was serious, alert, the expression of a cop who had learned to trust his instincts. Daniel gestured toward the house. "Something's off, Bill. Look at the windows. They're all intact. Neighbors reported breaking glass 20 minutes ago, but I don't see any damage. And listen." They both stopped and listened to the neighborhood sounds. Air conditioners humming, a dog barking 3 houses down, children playing in a backyard across the street. But from 2247 Maple Street, nothing. "Too quiet," Morrison agreed, his hand resting on his weapon. "If there was a domestic in progress, we should hear something. Either they've moved the fight somewhere else or somebody's hurt," Daniel finished. Morrison nodded grimly. "Back door? I'll take it. Give me 2 minutes to get in position, then go through the front." They separated without another word, moving with the practiced coordination that had developed over months of watching each other's backs. Daniel circled around the small house, noting the well-maintained fence, the garden with wilting tomato plants that needed water, the back porch with 2 lawn chairs positioned to catch the evening shade. The back door was unlocked. Daniel keyed his radio quietly. 246. Back door is open. I'm going in. Copy. Front door in 30 seconds. Daniel drew his weapon and eased through the door into a small kitchen. Dishes in the sink, coffee pot still warm. A woman's purse on the counter with its contents spilled out. Keys, wallet, lipstick, all scattered as if someone had been searching through it quickly. He moved through the kitchen into a living room dominated by a large television and comfortable furniture. Family photos on the mantel showed a middle-aged couple with 2 teenage children. Everything looked normal, except for an overturned lamp and what looked like spots of blood on the carpet near the hallway entrance. Morrison's voice came through the radio. "Front door locked. Going in hard." The sound of the front door splintering echoed through the house as Morrison kicked it in. Daniel was already moving toward the hallway, following the blood trail, when he heard Morrison's voice from the living room. "Clear front. Moving toward you." "Blood trail leads to the basement," Daniel reported, finding stairs that descended into darkness. They regrouped at the top of the basement stairs, weapons drawn, listening to the sounds from below. A low moaning, the scrape of something being dragged across concrete. "Police!" Morrison shouted down the stairs. "Come up with your hands visible!" The sounds stopped. Morrison went first, Daniel right behind him, both men moving carefully down the wooden steps that creaked under their weight. The basement was cool and dark, lit only by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the circle of weak light, they found a scene that would stay with both of them for years. Robert Henley, 43 years old according to the ID in his wallet, lay unconscious on the concrete floor, his face a mask of blood from what looked like multiple blunt force injuries. His breathing was shallow, labored. Nearby, his wife Linda was bound to a metal folding chair with duct tape, her face swollen and bruised, terror in her eyes as she tried to speak through the tape covering her mouth. Standing over them both, holding a Louisville Slugger baseball bat dark with blood, was a man Daniel would later learn was Linda's brother Marcus Thompson. Thompson's eyes were wild, dilated, his movements jerky and unpredictable, the unmistakable signs of methamphetamine intoxication. "Drop the weapon," Morrison commanded, his service pistol trained on Thompson's center mass. Thompson spun around, the bat raised above his head, spittle flying from his mouth as he screamed incoherently. Daniel could see the man's total disconnection from reality, the drug-fueled rage that made him capable of anything. In the split second before Thompson swung the bat toward Morrison, Daniel made his move. Years of high school football had taught him how to tackle, and 18 months of police training had taught him when. He launched himself at Thompson from the side, driving his shoulder into the man's ribs and sending them both crashing into a stack of storage boxes. Morrison was on them instantly, securing the bat, while Daniel wrestled Thompson's arms behind his back. Even high on methamphetamines, Thompson was no match for 2 trained officers working in perfect coordination. "Stay down," Daniel commanded, pressing Thompson's face to the concrete while Morrison cuffed him. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but Daniel's heart was pounding, as if he'd run a marathon. This was why they trained, why they worked in pairs, why split-second timing and absolute trust between partners could mean the difference between going home safe and ending up in the morgue. 20 minutes later, the basement was full of paramedics, crime scene technicians, and supervising officers. Robert Henley was on his way to Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital with a severe concussion and possible skull fracture, but the EMTs thought he would survive. Linda Henley was being treated for facial injuries and shock. Marcus Thompson was in the back of a patrol car, the methamphetamines gradually wearing off enough for him to realize the magnitude of what he'd done. Morrison and Daniel stood on the front porch, watching the controlled chaos of a major crime scene, both men coming down from the adrenaline rush of a potentially deadly encounter. "Hell of a tackle, partner," Morrison said, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. "You probably saved that man's life." "We saved his life," Daniel corrected automatically. "If you hadn't drawn his attention, if you hadn't been ready to take the shot if necessary." Morrison smiled, and Daniel saw something in his expression that he hadn't seen before, genuine respect, not just for a junior partner who had performed adequately, but for an equal who had proven himself under pressure. "You know what I like about you, Rodriguez? You never take credit. That's rare in this job." Most cops I know would be telling anyone who'd listen about how they single-handedly saved the day. Daniel shrugged. My father taught me that integrity is what you do when nobody's watching. Smart man. What did he do? Construction worker. Came here from Mexico with nothing but work ethic and principles. Never missed a day of work in 30 years, even when he was so sick he could barely stand. Daniel's voice carried deep respect and affection. He always said that a man's word and his reputation are the only things that truly belong to him. Everything else can be taken away. Morrison was quiet for a moment, staring out at the neighborhood where people were beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the flashing lights and emergency vehicles. I wish I'd had a father like that, he said finally. It was the first truly personal thing Morrison had shared in 6 months of partnership, and Daniel sensed there was pain behind it, old wounds that had never quite healed. But he didn't push. Partners shared what they were ready to share when they were ready to share it. That evening, as they sat in the precinct finishing their incident reports, Morrison made an observation that would echo in Daniel's mind for decades to come. You know, Danny, this job, it tests you, every day. Sometimes the test is obvious, like what happened today. But sometimes it's subtle, sometimes the right choice is the easy choice. He paused, staring at the report on his desk, with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. But sometimes the right choice costs you everything. And that's when you find out who you really are. 2 years later, in October of 1987, the morning sun streamed through the Venetian blinds of Lieutenant Harris's corner office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where Detective William Morrison's promotion paperwork lay spread like a roadmap to his future. At 34, Morrison had spent 12 years clawing his way up from patrol officer to detective, and now he sat on the verge of the promotion that would change everything. Lieutenant Robert Harris was a 28-year veteran who had seen countless officers come and go, but Morrison had always impressed him. Where other detectives relied on connections or political maneuvering, Morrison had built his reputation on solid police work, attention to detail, and an almost obsessive dedication to closing cases. You've earned this, Morrison, Harris said, reaching for his pen to sign the final promotion document. Your record is exemplary. Clean disciplinary file, outstanding closure rate, and that domestic terrorism case you broke last month. Absolutely outstanding work. Morrison felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with something deeper. Validation. Every promotion, every commendation, every moment of recognition felt like proof that he had overcome the circumstances of his birth. His father, Thomas Morrison, had been a functioning alcoholic who'd worked sporadically at the Coors Brewery until his drinking became too obvious to ignore. When the plant finally fired him, Thomas had lasted exactly 6 more months before abandoning his family one cold February night in 1969, leaving behind a note that simply said, "I'm sorry, you'll be better off without me." Morrison's mother, Patricia, had worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads, cleaning offices at night, working retail during the day, and taking in laundry on weekends. She had died of a heart attack when Morrison was 22, exhausted from years of carrying burdens that should have been shared. Every achievement in Morrison's career felt like a promise kept to her memory. There's just one thing, Harris continued, setting down his pen and leaning back in his chair. Before this promotion becomes official, I need to discuss a case assignment, the Castellanos investigation. Morrison straightened. Everyone in the department knew about the Castellanos family, a sophisticated drug operation that had been running cocaine and heroin through Denver for nearly 5 years. They were smart, well-connected, and careful. Previous attempts to infiltrate their organization had failed spectacularly. The brass has decided we need someone to lead a major operation against them, Harris explained. Someone with the experience to coordinate multiple units, the intelligence to outthink organized criminals, and the integrity to handle the kind of money and temptation that comes with high-level drug cases. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for, a chance to make the kind of case that defined careers, that separated good detectives from legendary ones. It's big, Morrison. Career-making big. Successfully taking down the Castellanos operation would probably guarantee your promotion to captain within 2 years. But it's also dangerous. These aren't street-level dealers we're talking about. This is organized crime with connections all the way to Mexico, with enough money to buy information, intimidate witnesses, and eliminate threats. The Castellanos family operation was run by three brothers, Victor, Eduardo, and Ramon, who had immigrated from Guadalajara in the early 1980s with modest savings and ambitious plans. What had started as a small-scale marijuana operation had evolved into a sophisticated network, moving millions of dollars worth of cocaine through Denver every month. They owned legitimate businesses as fronts, had developed relationships with corrupt officials in Mexico, and maintained a level of operational security that had frustrated law enforcement for years. "I've been studying their operation for months," Morrison said. "They're methodical, disciplined. Taking them down will require long-term surveillance, careful intelligence gathering, and perfect coordination between multiple units." "Exactly. Which brings me to personnel. You'll have your choice of team members, but I'd strongly recommend keeping Rodriguez. That kid has exceptional instincts and, more importantly, he's completely loyal to you." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Daniel had been transferred to the narcotics division 6 months earlier as part of a department reorganization, but they had continued to work together on joint operations. Their professional partnership had evolved into genuine friendship, perhaps the closest friendship Morrison had ever experienced. "Rodriguez is solid," Morrison agreed. "Absolutely solid. I trust him with my life." "Good. Because on this operation you might have to." That evening, Morrison drove through the suburban streets toward Daniel's neighborhood, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. The Castellanos case represented everything he'd worked toward. A chance to prove himself as a leader, to make the kind of impact that would be remembered long after he retired. Daniel's house sat on a quiet street in a middle-class subdivision, a modest 2-story colonial with a small but well-maintained yard. As Morrison pulled into the driveway, he could see Daniel in the backyard, patiently running alongside his 4-year-old daughter Carmen as she wobbled on a small bicycle with training wheels. The scene made Morrison's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Watching Daniel with his daughter, seeing the easy love and natural patience in their interaction, Morrison felt the familiar ache of something missing from his own life. At 34, he was successful, respected, financially stable, but he was also alone in a way that success couldn't remedy. "Uncle Bill!" Carmen shrieked when she spotted him, abandoning her bicycle to run across the yard and launch herself into his arms. Daniel and Maria Rodriguez had started calling him Uncle Bill when Carmen was born, making him her honorary godfather and welcoming him into their family circle with a generosity that still amazed Morrison. It was the closest thing to real family he'd experienced since his mother's death. "Hey there, Princess," Morrison said, lifting Carmen up and spinning her around. "How's the bike riding coming along?" "I can do it without Daddy holding on now. I went all the way from the fence to the tree. Want to see?" "I'd love to see." As Carmen demonstrated her newfound skill, cycling unsteadily but determinedly across the backyard, while Daniel jogged alongside, calling out encouragement, Morrison felt the familiar longing for this kind of domestic happiness. Maria appeared on the back porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel and smiling at the scene. "Bill, perfect timing. I just pulled enchiladas out of the oven. You're staying for dinner, right?" "If you'll have me." "Always." Later, as they sat around the Rodriguez family's dining room table sharing Maria's excellent cooking, Morrison found himself relaxing in a way that only happened in this house, with these people who had somehow decided to love him despite his reserve and emotional distance. "So," Daniel said as they cleared the dinner dishes, "what brought you by tonight? You looked pretty serious when you arrived." Morrison glanced at Maria, who was settling Carmen in front of the television with a coloring book, then at Daniel. "I got the promotion. Sergeant Morrison, as of Monday morning." "Bill, that's fantastic," Maria called from the living room. "Congratulations." Daniel grinned and extended his hand. "Well-deserved, partner. I couldn't be happier for you." "There's more," Morrison said. "Harris wants me to lead a major operation, the Castellanos investigation." Daniel's expression grew serious. He knew as well as Morrison what the Castellanos case represented: months of dangerous work, high stakes, and the kind of risks that could end careers or lives. "It's ambitious," Morrison continued, 6 months of surveillance to identify their entire network, map their operations, build airtight cases against everyone involved. Then coordinated raids that would bring down the whole organization. Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching his daughter color contentedly in the next room. It's risky, Bill. These people don't mess around. They have money, connections, and a history of dealing harshly with threats to their operation. I know, but it's also our chance to make a real difference. Get these drugs off the street for good. Maybe save some lives in the process. Daniel set down his coffee cup and looked directly at Morrison. Maria's pregnant again. Morrison felt a smile break across his face. Danny, that's wonderful news. Congratulations. It is wonderful, Daniel agreed. But it also makes me think about the risks we take in this job, about what happens to families when cops don't come home. Morrison understood. The job carried risks for any officer, but for fathers every decision carried the extra weight of responsibility to children who depended on them. I need a partner I can trust completely, Morrison said carefully. Someone who will have my back no matter what happens. Someone I know will make good decisions under pressure. Are you interested? Daniel looked through the archway at his daughter, now successfully demonstrating her coloring skills for her mother, her delighted laughter filling the house with warmth. Then he looked back at his friend and partner. I'm in, he said firmly. But we do this clean, Bill. No shortcuts, no compromises, no cutting corners to make the case easier. If we're going to bring down the Castellanos, we do it the right way, by the book, with integrity, the way cops are supposed to work. Absolutely, Morrison agreed. By the book, all the way. They shook hands across the Rodriguez family's dinner table, neither man knowing that this handshake agreement would ultimately destroy their friendship and change both their lives forever. By March of 1988, the coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Sergeant William Morrison took another sip anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste as he adjusted the telephoto lens on the camera mounted in their unmarked surveillance van. 4 months of watching, waiting, and documenting had led to this moment, the night they would finally catch Victor Castellanos in the act. The warehouse district stretched out before them like a concrete wasteland, all loading docks and chain-link fences under harsh sodium lights. At 11:30 p.m., the area was mostly deserted, except for the occasional security guard making rounds and the steady stream of trucks serving the night shift at the meatpacking plant 3 blocks away. Movement at the main entrance, Detective Daniel Rodriguez whispered into his radio, his voice tight with concentration. Blue Cadillac, license plate Charlie Delta 749. That's our boy. Morrison felt his pulse quicken as he watched Victor Castellanos step out of his distinctive Cadillac Eldorado, the same car they'd been photographing for months as it made its rounds through Denver's underground drug network. Victor was 38 years old, impeccably dressed even at this hour, moving with the confident stride of a man who believed himself untouchable. The Castellanos operation had been everything Morrison hoped for and more. After 4 months of surveillance, his team had identified 23 members of the drug network, mapped their entire distribution system, and gathered enough evidence to bring down what was arguably the most sophisticated criminal organization in Denver's history. The warehouse district surveillance post had become a second home for Morrison and Rodriguez. Night after night, they had sat in their cramped van, sharing cold pizza and warm coffee, documenting the comings and goings of the Castellanos organization with the methodical patience of professional hunters. Morrison had grown to love this work, the intellectual challenge of outthinking criminals, the satisfaction of building an airtight case piece by piece, the adrenaline rush of being so close to dangerous men who had no idea they were being watched. It was police work at its finest, the kind of investigation that separated real detectives from badge-wearing bureaucrats. Team 2, do you have eyes on the back entrance? Morrison keyed his radio, his voice calm despite the excitement building in his chest. Affirmative, Sergeant, no movement back here, all quiet. For the past month they had been building toward this specific night. Their informant, a mid-level dealer named Carlos Mendez who'd been arrested on possession charges and decided cooperation was preferable to prison, had told them about a major shipment coming in from Mexico. $2 million worth of pure Colombian cocaine, processed in Guadalajara and smuggled across the border in false-bottom compartments of legitimate produce trucks. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south, Rodriguez reported, 3 panel vans moving in convoy formation. Morrison adjusted his position to get a better view through the camera. This was it, the moment that would make his career. Victor Castellanos personally overseeing the largest drug shipment in Denver history, with Morrison's team positioned to document every detail. The next 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness as they watched the Castellanos crew methodically unload wooden crates from a semi-truck with Mexican plates. Through their telephoto lenses, they could see the care with which the workers handled each crate. The way Victor personally inspected random containers, the systematic way the operation proceeded. Morrison found himself thinking about his mother, wondering if she would have been proud to see him now, leading the kind of investigation that would be studied in police academies for years to come. Patricia Morrison had died believing her son would amount to something special, that the struggles of his childhood would forge him into a man capable of extraordinary things. "Sergeant, we're seeing product," Rodriguez said quietly. "Confirming white powder in brick formation, multiple kilos visible." Morrison smiled grimly. After months of surveillance, they finally had Victor Castellanos exactly where they wanted him, in possession of enough cocaine to put him away for life. "All units, this is Morrison," he broadcast on the tactical frequency. "Prepare for breach on my signal. Remember, we want Victor alive and talkative. Everyone else is expendable. But Victor Castellanos walks out of this warehouse in handcuffs, not a body bag." Within 30 minutes, the warehouse was surrounded by Denver PD's tactical team. Morrison had planned every detail of the raid for weeks, accounting for every possible escape route, every potential complication. There would be no mistakes, no opportunities for the Castellanos organization to slip away. Go, go, go. The tactical team breached the warehouse from 3 directions simultaneously, moving with the precision of a military operation. Morrison and Rodriguez followed the primary team through the main entrance, weapons drawn, ready for anything. But the raid was almost anticlimactic. The Castellanos crew, caught completely off guard in the middle of their inventory, surrendered without firing a shot. Victor himself was found in a small office at the back of the warehouse, calmly shredding documents as if he'd been expecting this moment for months. "Victor Castellanos," Morrison said, approaching the office with his weapon holstered, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to distribute controlled substances." Victor looked up from his shredding machine, a slight smile on his face. "Sergeant Morrison, I presume. I've been wondering when we would finally meet." The comment sent a chill down Morrison's spine. How did Victor know his name? How long had the Castellanos organization been aware they were under surveillance? 2 hours later, Morrison stood in the warehouse surrounded by evidence bags and arrest reports, feeling like he was standing on top of the world. 23 arrests, $2 million in cocaine seized, and another $1.8 million in cash found hidden in compartments throughout the warehouse. It was the biggest drug bust in Denver PD history, and his name would be attached to it forever. "Hell of a job, Sergeant," Lieutenant Harris said, slapping Morrison on the back as crime scene technicians continued processing evidence. "The chief wants to see you first thing Monday morning." "I think you know what that conversation is going to be about, Captain Morrison." The promotion was practically guaranteed now. Morrison could already imagine the ceremony, the newspaper coverage, the respect in his colleagues' eyes when they saw those captain's bars on his uniform. Daniel approached, carrying an evidence bag full of bundled cash, his expression troubled. "Bill, we need to talk." "What's up, partner?" "The money count. I've been through it 3 times now. We're showing 8 million in cash seized, but our informant said there should be 2.3 million. Morrison felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Count it again." "I did. 4 times. We're missing $500,000. Morrison looked around the warehouse, still bustling with activity as officers processed the crime scene. $500,000 was a lot of money to just disappear, especially from a secured crime scene. Could Mendez have been wrong about the amount? "Maybe," Daniel said, but his voice carried doubt. "But Bill, there's something else. I saw Captain Richardson near the evidence table earlier, when you were interviewing Victor. When I asked him what he was doing here, he said you'd requested his assistance." Morrison's blood ran cold. He hadn't requested assistance from anyone, especially not Captain Richardson, whose reputation for flexible ethics was well known throughout the department. "Are you sure it was Richardson?" "Positive, and Bill—" Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. I think we need to inventory everything again. With official witnesses. Document everything from scratch. Looking at his partner's concerned face, Morrison realized that their perfect bust might have just become a perfect nightmare. But in that moment, riding high on adrenaline and the promise of career-making success, he couldn't imagine just how devastating that nightmare would become. "Let's worry about it tomorrow," Morrison said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Tonight we celebrate. We just took down the biggest drug operation in Denver history." But Daniel Rodriguez wasn't celebrating. He was already thinking about proper procedures, about documentation requirements, about making sure everything was handled correctly. It was exactly the kind of attention to detail that made him an exceptional police officer. It was also exactly the kind of attention to detail that would soon make him Morrison's greatest threat. 8 months later, in November of 1988, Internal Affairs Detective Lisa Morgan had been investigating financial irregularities in the Evidence Division for 3 weeks when she stumbled across the Castellanos discrepancy, and what had started as a routine audit of departmental procedures had gradually transformed into something much more sinister and complex. Detective Morgan was 34 years old, a 12-year veteran who had transferred to Internal Affairs 2 years earlier, after growing disillusioned with the casual corruption she'd witnessed in narcotics. She had a reputation for being thorough, incorruptible, and relentlessly persistent, qualities that made her both respected and feared throughout the department. Other officers called her the Bloodhound behind her back, not always with affection. The Evidence Division audit had been ordered by Chief Patterson after a string of minor discrepancies in other cases: missing drug samples, unaccounted for cash seizures, evidence that seemed to walk away from supposedly secure storage facilities. Most of the irregularities were small, probably the result of sloppy paperwork rather than deliberate theft. But the Castellanos case was different. She sat across from Sergeant William Morrison in Interview Room B, a windowless space painted institutional green with a metal table and uncomfortable chairs designed to encourage honesty through discomfort. Morrison looked confident, almost cocky, sitting with his arms crossed and his uniform perfectly pressed. This was a man who had never been seriously questioned about anything, who had built his career on a foundation of solid arrests and positive media coverage. "Sergeant Morrison, thank you for coming in," Detective Morgan began, opening a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. "I need to ask you about the Castellanos raid from March 18th, specifically about the cash seizure." "Of course. Happy to help with whatever you need." Morgan studied Morrison's face carefully. She had interviewed hundreds of officers over the years, and she had learned to read the subtle signs of deception, the micro-expressions, the changes in body language, the carefully controlled responses that often revealed more than spontaneous answers. "According to your initial incident report, your team seized $2.3 million in cash during the warehouse raid, but the final evidence inventory shows only $1.8 million. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Morrison's confidence flickered for just a moment, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that Morgan caught immediately. There it was, the first crack in the facade. "Detective Morgan, I filed my reports based on preliminary counts conducted at the scene under difficult conditions. The final inventory was conducted by the Evidence Division under proper chain of custody procedures. If there's a discrepancy, it would be between the preliminary estimate and the final professional count." "I see." Morgan made a note, deliberately taking her time to let the silence stretch. "And who conducted the preliminary count?" "My partner, Detective Rodriguez, and myself." "And where is Detective Rodriguez today?" Morrison shifted slightly in his chair. "Detective Rodriguez is currently assigned to patrol duty." Morgan consulted her notes, even though she had memorized every detail of Rodriguez's personnel file. "That's quite a demotion for someone who was part of the biggest drug bust in department history. From detective in narcotics back to patrol officer. That must have been disappointing for him." Rodriguez requested the transfer. "Actually," Morgan said, her voice remaining conversational, "according to his personnel file, Detective Rodriguez was transferred against his will after filing a formal complaint about evidence handling procedures in the Castellanos case. Would you like to revise your statement?" Morrison realized he was in trouble, real, serious trouble. For 8 months, he had managed to keep Rodriguez quiet through a combination of threats, transfers, and bureaucratic intimidation. But now Internal Affairs was asking the right questions, and Morrison could feel his carefully constructed story beginning to crumble. "Detective Morgan, I'm not sure what you're implying, but I resent the suggestion that there was any impropriety in the handling of evidence during the Castellanos investigation. That operation was conducted by the book, with multiple witnesses and proper documentation at every stage." "I'm not implying anything, Sergeant Morrison. I'm investigating a missing $500,000 from a drug seizure. That constitutes theft of evidence, which is a felony under state and federal law." The room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant sounds of the precinct. Phones ringing, conversations in the hallway, the everyday noise of police work continuing around them. Morrison looked at the woman across from him and recognized a different kind of danger than he'd ever faced on the street. This wasn't a drug dealer with a gun or a domestic violence suspect high on adrenaline. This was a methodical, intelligent investigator who would keep digging until she found the truth. "I think I'd like to speak with my union representative," Morrison said carefully. "That's certainly your right," Morgan replied, closing her folder. "But Sergeant Morrison, before you lawyer up, you should know that we've already spoken with Detective Rodriguez. Twice, actually. And his story doesn't match yours." After Morrison left with his union lawyer, Detective Morgan sat alone in the interview room, reviewing her notes and thinking about the complex dynamics she was uncovering. Daniel Rodriguez had been cooperative, professional, and consistent in his statements. He had told her about the missing money, about his concerns regarding evidence procedures, and about his attempts to address the issues through proper departmental channels. What Rodriguez hadn't told her was who he suspected of taking the money. When pressed, he had simply said, "I want to believe the best of my fellow officers, Detective Morgan, but the money is missing, and someone needs to be held accountable." Morgan had been a cop for 12 years. She had seen good cops, bad cops, and cops who fell somewhere in between. She had investigated corruption cases that ranged from officers taking free meals to complex schemes involving drug money and organized crime. But she had rarely encountered someone as genuinely committed to doing the right thing as Daniel Rodriguez appeared to be. The problem was that Rodriguez's integrity might not be enough to overcome Morrison's political connections. Morrison was the department's golden boy, the sergeant who had risen from poverty to become the face of successful drug enforcement. He had allies at every level of the department, from patrol officers who admired his street credentials to administrators who appreciated his media-friendly success stories. Rodriguez, on the other hand, was just a patrol officer who had made enemies by asking uncomfortable questions about a case that everyone wanted to celebrate as an unqualified victory. That evening, Detective Morgan drove to Rodriguez's house, a modest ranch-style home in a middle-class neighborhood where children's bicycles sat on front porches and American flags hung from mailboxes. She found Daniel in his garage, working on the engine of an old Chevrolet pickup truck, his hands covered in grease but his eyes clear and focused. "Detective Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I have a few more questions about the Castellanos case." Daniel looked up from the engine, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Of course, Detective Morgan. Would you like to come inside? Maria just made a fresh pot of coffee." They sat at the Rodriguez family's kitchen table while Maria served coffee and homemade chocolate chip cookies that were still warm from the oven. Their daughter Carmen, now 7 years old, was at the counter doing homework, occasionally looking up to study the stranger who had come to visit her father. "Mr. Rodriguez," Morgan began, "I want to be direct with you. I believe you're telling the truth about the missing money and the irregularities in evidence handling, but proving it is going to be extremely difficult. Sergeant Morrison has influential friends throughout the department." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand the situation, Detective Morgan. The question is, are you prepared for what might happen if you stick to your story? This investigation could become very ugly, very public. There could be serious consequences for your career, your family's financial security, your reputation in the community." Daniel looked at his wife, who gave him an encouraging nod, then at his daughter, working diligently on her arithmetic homework. "Detective Morgan, my father used to tell me that a man's integrity is like his shadow. It follows him everywhere, and he can never run from it. I saw what I saw during that investigation. I documented what I documented. I reported what I reported through proper channels. If that makes me enemies within the department, so be it. Even if it costs you your career, even then. Detective Morgan finished her coffee and stood to leave. At the front door, she turned back to look at Daniel Rodriguez. "Mr. Rodriguez, off the record, you're one of the good ones. Don't let them change that." After she left, Daniel and Maria sat together at their kitchen table, holding hands in the quiet house while Carmen continued her homework, unaware that her father's principles were about to be tested in ways that would change their family's life forever. "Are you sure about this?" Maria asked quietly. "I'm sure." "What if Morrison really did take the money? What if he tries to retaliate?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the suburban street where they had planned to raise their children, where they had imagined building a secure, stable life. "Then he's not the man I thought he was," Daniel said finally. "And that breaks my heart. But it doesn't change what's right." 3 days later, Captain Morrison would walk into Daniel's office with a manila envelope and a direct order that would destroy their friendship forever. On November 15, 1988, at 11:47 p.m., the precinct was mostly empty when Captain Morrison burst through the doors, his usually immaculate uniform disheveled, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold November air. Daniel Rodriguez was finishing his shift report, one of the few officers still working this late. "Rodriguez, my office now." Daniel had been expecting this confrontation for 3 days, ever since Detective Morgan's second interview. He'd seen the fear in Morrison's eyes during their brief encounters in the hallway, the way his former partner avoided eye contact. Morrison's office was on the second floor, a corner space with windows overlooking the parking lot. Daniel had been here countless times over the past 3 years. Strategy sessions for the Castellanos case, promotion discussions, friendly conversations about family and future plans. Tonight felt different. Morrison closed the door and pulled the blinds, his movements sharp and nervous. "We have a problem, Danny, a big one." "I figured as much." Morrison stopped pacing and looked at his former partner. "Internal Affairs came to see me about the Castellanos money. They say you've been talking to them. They asked questions. I answered them honestly." "Honestly?" Morrison's voice rose. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What you're doing to me? To my family?" Daniel remained calm. "I told them what I saw, what I reported at the time. The same thing I told you 8 months ago." Morrison pulled out a manila envelope from his desk drawer. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Danny. And I need you to remember that we're friends. That I was best man at your wedding. That I held your daughter when she was born. What's in the envelope, Bill? Evidence. Evidence that will solve both our problems." Morrison opened the envelope and pulled out several photographs and documents. Daniel recognized them immediately. Evidence bags from other cases, all bearing the signature of Officer Steve Jenkins. "Jenkins has access to the evidence room," Morrison continued. "He works night shift, minimal supervision. He's young. He's got student loans, a new baby, financial pressures." Daniel felt his stomach sink as he understood what Morrison was suggesting. "You want me to plant this in Jenkins' locker?" "I want you to help me solve a problem. Jenkins took the money, Danny. He had opportunity. He had motive. This just proves it." "Jenkins didn't take the money." Morrison's eyes flashed dangerously. "How do you know that?" "Because I know who did." The room fell silent except for the hum of the heating system. Morrison stared at Daniel for a long moment, and in that stare Daniel saw confirmation of his worst fears. "You don't know anything," Morrison said quietly. "You think you know something, but you don't have proof. You've got suspicions, theories, but if you push this, Danny, if you force me into a corner, then we both go down. Maybe we should both go down." Morrison slammed his hand on the desk. "Easy for you to say. You've got family money. Maria's father owns 3 restaurants. You'll be fine. But me? I came from nothing, Danny. Nothing. My father was a drunk who left us with bill collectors and broken promises. This job, this rank, it's everything I've worked for. It's not worth destroying an innocent man's life. Jenkins will be fine. A few months of investigation, maybe a trial, but without real evidence, they'll never convict him. He'll get his job back, probably with back pay, but if this lands on me..." Morrison's voice cracked. "Sarah's pregnant, Danny. We're having a baby. If I go to prison, what happens to them?" Daniel thought about Morrison's wife, Sarah, who had become close friends with Maria. A sweet woman who taught kindergarten and dreamed of having children. The news of her pregnancy should have been a celebration. There has to be another way. There is. You plant this evidence, we both forget about the money discrepancy, and everyone moves on with their lives. I can't do that. Morrison's expression hardened. You can, and you will. This is a direct order, Rodriguez. Daniel looked at his friend, his former friend, and saw a stranger. A desperate, cornered man who would sacrifice anyone to save himself. From my friend, or from my captain? From your captain. And if you refuse, I'll make sure the theft gets pinned on you instead. Your word against mine, Danny. Who do you think they'll believe? The decorated captain who solved the biggest drug case in department history, or the patrol officer with a grudge? Daniel stood up slowly. Through the office window, he could see the parking lot where his patrol car sat under a streetlight. In a few hours, he would either drive home to his family as a police officer or as an unemployed man with an uncertain future. You're asking me to destroy my integrity to save your career. I'm asking you to be practical, to think about the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that you stole $500,000 and you want an innocent man to pay for it. Morrison's face flushed red. I didn't steal anything. That money was compensation for 3 years of risking my life to bring down drug dealers, 3 years of putting my family in danger, 3 years of working for a department that pays me $42,000 a year to stop criminals who make millions. So you decided to become one of them. I decided to take what I earned. The truth hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. After months of denial and misdirection, Morrison had finally admitted what Daniel had suspected all along. I won't plant that evidence, Daniel said quietly, and I won't lie for you. Morrison sat down heavily in his chair. Then you're a fool and you're fired. On what grounds? Insubordination, refusal to follow a direct order. Your word against mine, Danny, and my word carries a lot more weight around here. Daniel walked to the door, then turned back. You know what the worst part is, Bill? I looked up to you. I wanted to be the kind of cop you were. Turns out I already am. What's that supposed to mean? I'm exactly the kind of cop you used to be, before you forgot who you were. Daniel left Morrison's office and walked downstairs to clean out his desk. 20 minutes later, he turned in his badge and gun to the night supervisor and walked out of the Denver Police Department for the last time. Behind him, Captain Morrison sat alone in his office, staring at the envelope full of fake evidence he would now have to plant himself. 2 weeks later, on November 28, 1988, Officer Steve Jenkins was having the best day of his career when Internal Affairs Detective Lisa Morgan walked into the evidence room at 3:17 p.m. He'd just learned that his application for the detective training program had been approved, and his wife had called to tell him their 6-month-old son had taken his first steps. Officer Jenkins, I'm Detective Morgan, Internal Affairs. I need to speak with you. The smile faded from Steve's face. Every cop knew that a visit from Internal Affairs was never good news. What about evidence storage procedures, specifically regarding the Castellanos drug seizure from March? Steve's relief was visible. The Castellanos case was legendary around the department, the biggest drug bust in Denver history. Being asked about procedures for such a major case was actually an honor. Of course. What do you need to know? Detective Morgan consulted her notepad. According to our records, you had access to the evidence storage room during the period when discrepancies were discovered in the cash inventory. Can you walk me through your procedures for handling currency evidence? For the next 30 minutes, Steve explained the meticulous process he followed for cataloging and storing evidence. He was young but thorough, the kind of detail-oriented officer that departments valued. Officer Jenkins, during your shifts, did you ever notice anything unusual about the Castellanos evidence? Anyone accessing it who shouldn't have been? No, ma'am. That evidence was high priority. I logged every person who came near those storage units. Detective Morgan made notes. And where do you keep those logs? In my locker. I maintain personal backup records of all major evidence handling. Could you show me those logs? They walked to the locker room where Steve opened his standard-issue metal locker. Inside were the usual personal items, extra uniform shirts, deodorant, family photos, and a thick folder of handwritten logs. As Steve reached for the folder, Detective Morgan spotted something else, a manila envelope tucked behind his extra shirts. "What's in the envelope, Officer Jenkins?" Steve looked confused. "I don't know. I've never seen that before." Detective Morgan's expression grew grave. "I need you to remove it carefully. Don't touch the contents." Steve pulled out the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were 5 evidence bags containing bundles of cash, all bearing official evidence tags from the Castellanos seizure. "Officer Jenkins, you're under arrest for theft of evidence." The next 2 hours were a blur of handcuffs, Miranda rights, and phone calls. Steve Jenkins, who had started the day as a rising star in the Denver Police Department, ended it in a holding cell, facing federal charges that could send him to prison for 20 years. Captain Morrison received the call at home during dinner. Sarah was telling him about her visit to the obstetrician when the phone rang. "Morrison, Captain, this is Detective Morgan. We've made an arrest in the Castellanos evidence theft." Morrison felt his heart pounding. "Who?" "Officer Steve Jenkins. We found the missing cash in his locker." Morrison closed his eyes in relief. It was over. The nightmare that had consumed his life for 8 months was finally over. "Good work, Detective. I'll be in early tomorrow to review the case file." After he hung up, Sarah looked at him with concern. "You look pale. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, just work." But everything wasn't fine. That night, Morrison lay awake thinking about Steve Jenkins, a young officer whose only crime had been working the night shift with access to the evidence room. Morrison had planted that evidence 3 days earlier, waiting for the right moment for it to be discovered. He thought about Daniel Rodriguez, who had refused to participate in the frame-up and had been fired for his integrity. Rodriguez was now working security at a shopping mall, his police career destroyed. Most of all, he thought about the $500,000 hidden in a safety deposit box across town. Money that was supposed to secure his family's future, but felt more like a curse with each passing day. At Steve Jenkins' trial 6 months later, Morrison testified as a character witness for the prosecution. He told the jury about Jenkins' access to the evidence room, about his financial pressures, about opportunity and motive. He did not tell them about Daniel Rodriguez's warnings about missing money, or about the direct order he'd given Rodriguez to plant evidence, or about the long, sleepless nights when he'd questioned every decision that had led him to this moment. Steve Jenkins was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. His wife divorced him while he was incarcerated. His son grew up without a father. Daniel Rodriguez watched the trial from the gallery, never testifying, never speaking to reporters. When it was over, he walked out of the courthouse and drove home to his family, carrying the knowledge that an innocent man was going to prison because he had refused to become a criminal. Captain Morrison was promoted to deputy chief 2 years later. The successful prosecution of the evidence theft case was cited as an example of his commitment to integrity and justice. But late at night, when Sarah and their daughter were asleep, Morrison would sometimes drive to the 24-hour diner on Colfax Avenue and sit alone in a corner booth, wondering if Daniel Rodriguez ever thought about what might have been if he had just followed orders. The truth was a weight that grew heavier with each passing year, and Morrison was beginning to understand that some burdens are too heavy to carry forever. 7 months after being fired, in June of 1989, the electronic chirp of Daniel Rodriguez's security radio cut through the oppressive silence of Southgate Shopping Mall at 2:17 a.m., another reminder that this was his life now, walking endless corridors of closed storefronts, while the rest of Denver slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that the man protecting their consumer paradise had once carried a badge and sworn to serve and protect. 6 nights a week, Daniel patrolled these sterile hallways under flickering fluorescent lights, checking locked doors, monitoring security cameras that recorded nothing more exciting than maintenance crews and the occasional raccoon that had found its way inside. The pay was $8.50 an hour, a third of what he'd earned as a police officer, barely enough to cover rent on the small apartment he'd moved into after selling the family home. At 31 years old, Daniel Rodriguez had become professionally invisible. The termination report followed him everywhere like a persistent shadow. Insubordination, refusal to follow direct orders, not recommended for rehire. Those words had been carefully crafted by Morrison to ensure that no police department would consider hiring Daniel, even departments desperate for experienced officers. Morrison had made personal calls to police chiefs across Colorado, painting Daniel as a problem officer who couldn't be trusted to follow orders under pressure. During the day, when he should have been sleeping, Daniel often found himself lying awake in his small bedroom, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the career he'd lost. Police work had been more than a job for him. It had been a calling, a way of honoring his father's immigrant dreams and his own deep belief that good people could make a difference in the world. Now he spent his nights walking past Spencer's Gifts and Orange Julius, past stores selling cheap jewelry and overpriced electronics, past the sad remnants of American retail culture that somehow seemed like a metaphor for his own diminished circumstances. Marisha and Carmen had moved in with Maria's parents 3 months earlier, temporarily, they all insisted, just until Daniel could get back on his feet professionally. But it had been 7 months since his firing, and he was no closer to finding meaningful work than he'd been the night Morrison destroyed his career. The worst part wasn't the financial pressure, though that was crushing enough. The worst part was watching his 4-year-old daughter try to understand why Daddy lived in a different house now, why he looked so sad all the time, why they couldn't afford the little luxuries that other families took for granted. "Unit 7, respond to possible break-in at Spencer's," came the voice through his radio. "Silent alarm activated." Daniel sighed and headed toward the novelty store, knowing from 8 months of experience that he would find nothing more threatening than a motion detector triggered by a balloon or a display that had toppled over. In all his time working mall security, the most serious incident he'd encountered was teenagers trying to sneak into the movie theater after hours. As he walked past the empty fountain in the center court, Daniel caught his reflection in the darkened store windows. The confident police officer, who had once worked these same hallways during community outreach events, was gone, replaced by a man in an ill-fitting security uniform carrying a flashlight instead of a gun, reduced to protecting stores that sold joke t-shirts and lava lamps. His radio crackled again. "Unit 7, false alarm at Spencer's. Motion detector malfunction. Return to normal patrol." Normal patrol. The phrase was cruelly ironic. Nothing about his current situation felt normal, and Daniel suspected it never would again. He made his way to the food court, where a few late-night cleaning crews were working their way through the day's accumulation of grease and garbage. These were good people, immigrants mostly, working multiple jobs to support their families, people who reminded Daniel of his own father's tireless work ethic. They nodded respectfully when they saw him, calling him Officer Rodriguez, even though he'd explained repeatedly that he wasn't a real officer anymore. At 4 a.m., Daniel took his mandatory break in the security office, a cramped room filled with television monitors showing empty corridors and vacant parking lots. He opened his lunch bag and found a note from Carmen, written in her careful kindergarten handwriting. "Daddy, I miss you. When are you coming home?" The question broke his heart because he didn't have an answer. Maria had been patient, supportive, understanding about the impossible situation Morrison had created, but patience had limits, and their marriage was showing the strain of financial pressure, professional humiliation, and the uncertainty of their future. Last week, Maria had mentioned that her cousin Luis was expanding his restaurant business and looking for managers. "It's good, steady work," she'd said carefully. "The pay isn't great, but it's better than security, and you'd be home nights with the family." Daniel knew she was right. He also knew that taking a job managing a restaurant would mean accepting that his law enforcement career was truly over, that at 31 years old, he would be starting from scratch in a new profession with no relevant experience and a family depending on him. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. "Southgate Security, Rodriguez speaking. Danny, it's Marcus Chen." Daniel sat up straighter. Marcus had been a fellow detective in narcotics, one of the few cops who had remained friendly after Daniel's firing. More importantly, Marcus was someone Daniel trusted completely, a man whose integrity had never been questioned. "Marcus, it's good to hear from you. What's got you up at this hour?" "I'm working night shift in internal affairs now." "Danny, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely straight with me." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Internal affairs meant serious business. and Marcus's tone suggested this wasn't a social call. "Okay, the Jenkins case. Do you think he really did it?" The question hung in the air like a landmine waiting to explode. Daniel knew that anything he said could be used against him, that admitting his suspicions about Morrison could make his already desperate situation even worse. But he also knew that Steve Jenkins was sitting in a federal prison cell, branded as a corrupt cop, while his real crime had been working the night shift with access to evidence. "Why are you asking, Marcus?" "Because something doesn't add up. I've been reviewing the case file as part of a broader investigation into evidence handling procedures, and there are inconsistencies. The evidence was too convenient, too neat. Jenkins had no prior financial problems, no history of misconduct, no connections to any criminal organizations. And your termination report?" Marcus paused. "It doesn't match Morrison's usual administrative style." Daniel closed his eyes, remembering that terrible night when Morrison had given him a direct order to plant evidence, when their friendship had died in the space of a single conversation. "Marcus, what do you want me to tell you?" "I want you to tell me the truth. All of it. If there's even a chance that Jenkins is innocent." Daniel looked at the security monitors, at the empty mall corridors that had become his world. He thought about Carmen's note, about Maria's patient understanding, about Steve Jenkins sitting in prison while Morrison enjoyed his success and promotion. "The truth is dangerous, Marcus. It destroyed my career. It could destroy yours too." "Let me worry about that. Steve Jenkins has a son, Danny, a little boy who's growing up thinking his father is a criminal. If Jenkins is innocent, if there's evidence that could clear him, if Jenkins is innocent, then proving it won't bring back the last year of his life. It won't undo the damage to his family. It won't restore his reputation or give him back his career. And it won't change the fact that the man who framed him is now Deputy Chief Morrison." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "So you're just going to let it go? Let an innocent man rot in prison while his family suffers?" Daniel stood up and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. In a few hours the sun would rise, the stores would open, and families would come to shop and eat and enjoy their Saturday. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that the man watching over their security was a disgraced ex-cop carrying secrets that could destroy one of the most powerful men in the Denver Police Department. "Marcus, I made my choice 8 months ago when I refused to plant evidence on Steve Jenkins. I chose integrity over career security, truth over personal safety. And you know what? It cost me everything. My job, my home, my family's financial stability, my professional reputation. So don't lecture me about letting things go. I gave up everything for the truth, and the truth didn't matter to anyone who had the power to act on it. It matters now. Does it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the corrupt cop got promoted to deputy chief, and the honest cop is working mall security for $8.50 an hour." Marcus sighed heavily. "Danny, I know you're bitter. I know the system failed you. But if we can prove Morrison framed Jenkins, then what? Morrison goes to prison? Maybe if you can build a case that sticks. Jenkins gets out, probably, but after serving hard time for something he didn't do. And what do I get? A pat on the head and a job application that still says terminated for insubordination. You get justice." Daniel almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Justice? Marcus, justice would have been Morrison facing consequences 8 months ago. Justice would have been the system listening to the honest cop instead of protecting the corrupt one. What we're talking about now isn't justice. It's revenge. And revenge doesn't pay rent or put food on my daughter's table. After Marcus hung up, Daniel sat alone in the security office, staring at the monitors showing endless empty corridors. He thought about Steve Jenkins, about Morrison, about the choices that had led him to this moment of professional exile and personal isolation. The truth was still there, still burning in his chest like a coal that would never cool. But the truth was a luxury he could no longer afford, a principle that had already cost him more than he could bear to lose. At least that's what he told himself as he returned to his patrol, walking the empty halls of suburban commerce, while the real criminals slept peacefully in their comfortable beds, protected by their badges and their carefully constructed lies. 7 years passed. In December of 1995, Deputy Chief William Morrison stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the fourth floor of Denver Police Headquarters, watching the early morning snow fall on the city below like ash from some distant fire. At 42, he was the youngest deputy chief in department history, and the betting among political insiders was that he would be named chief when current Chief Patterson retired in 18 months. His office was a monument to professional achievement. The walls displayed an impressive collection of commendations, awards, and photographs documenting a distinguished career that had become the stuff of departmental legend. The centerpiece was a framed front page from the Denver Post with the headline, "Hero Cop Brings Down Drug Empire," featuring a photograph of Morrison standing victorious in the Castellanos warehouse. Next to it hung his diploma from the FBI National Academy, a certificate recognizing his completion of executive leadership training, and a photo of him shaking hands with the governor at a ceremony honoring outstanding law enforcement officers. By any external measure, William Morrison had achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a young patrol officer struggling to overcome his troubled background. He commanded the respect of his peers, the admiration of the media, and the trust of city officials who saw him as the future of professional policing in Denver. The irony was suffocating. His secretary's voice came through the intercom, interrupting his brooding contemplation of the snowfall. "Chief Morrison, Mrs. Morrison is online too. She says it's about Katie's appointment." Morrison picked up the phone, forcing warmth into a voice that felt increasingly hollow with each passing year. "Hey, beautiful. How did the appointment go?" Sarah's voice carried the exhaustion of a mother who had spent 7 years navigating the complex world of special needs education and medical interventions. "Dr. Harrison wants to discuss more intensive therapy options. Katie's making progress with reading, but she's still struggling with mathematical concepts. He thinks we should consider the specialized program at Children's Hospital." Morrison closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of financial pressure that seemed to grow heavier despite his professional success. Katie, now 11 years old, had been diagnosed with a complex learning disability that required extensive therapy, tutoring, and specialized educational services that stretched their budget to the breaking point. What kind of intensive therapy? How much are we talking about? 3 sessions a week, plus educational therapy, plus the possibility of switching her to Mountain View Academy. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Bill, even with our insurance, we're looking at maybe $1,500 a month. I don't know how we can manage that." Morrison stared at his desk, where his latest bank statement lay folded beneath a stack of budget reports. Despite his salary increases and bonuses, despite his success and growing reputation, the family was barely staying afloat financially. Sarah had cut her teaching hours to part-time to manage Katie's therapy schedule, reducing their household income just as their expenses continued to climb. What Sarah didn't know, what she could never know, was that there was another account, a safety deposit box containing $500,000 that could solve all their problems instantly, that could give Katie every opportunity she deserved, that could secure their family's future beyond their wildest dreams. Money that belonged to the city of Denver, money that Morrison had convinced himself he'd earned through 3 years of dangerous undercover work, but that felt more like blood money with each passing year. "We'll figure it out," Morrison said, the same empty reassurance he'd been giving for years. "We always do." "Will we?" "Bill, I know you're being considered for chief, but even if you get promoted, we can't keep living paycheck to paycheck. Maybe we should consider moving Katie to public school, finding a less expensive therapist." Morrison felt his chest tighten with familiar guilt and frustration. His daughter deserved the best care available, not budget alternatives that might compromise her development, because her father was too much of a coward to access money that could change everything. "Sarah, trust me. I'm working on something. Don't make any decisions about Katie's treatment yet." After he hung up, Morrison sat alone in his successful office, surrounded by symbols of his achievements, thinking about choices made 7 years earlier and their continuing consequences. The theft of the Castellanos money had seemed like such a simple solution at the time. Compensation for dangerous work, insurance against an uncertain future, a safety net that would protect his family from the financial struggles he'd experienced as a child. But the money had become a curse rather than a blessing. Every month that it sat untouched in that safety deposit box, was another month of watching his family struggle while holding the key to their problems. Every therapy session they couldn't afford, every opportunity they had to decline, every worry line that appeared on Sarah's face was a reminder of his cowardice. At first, Morrison had rationalized keeping the money by telling himself he'd earned it through dangerous work, that the city owed him hazard pay for 3 years of putting his life on the line. But as the years passed, those justifications felt increasingly hollow, increasingly desperate. Steve Jenkins had served 3 years of his 5-year sentence before dying in a prison fight. A young man whose only crime had been working the night shift, dead because Morrison had needed a scapegoat for his own theft. Daniel Rodriguez had disappeared from Morrison's life completely after his firing. Morrison knew he'd worked mall security for 2 years, then driven taxi for several more, before finally finding work as a high school teacher. A good man destroyed for refusing to compromise his integrity, now rebuilding his life in a profession that valued the honesty Morrison had abandoned. His phone rang again, interrupting his dark thoughts. "Chief Morrison, you have a visitor. A Mr. Rodriguez to see you. He says it's personal." Morrison's heart stopped. After 7 years of silence, Daniel Rodriguez was here, in the building, asking to see him. Morrison stood and straightened his uniform, checking his appearance in the mirror behind his desk. He looked like exactly what he was, a successful police administrator, respected and respectable, the embodiment of professional achievement. When Daniel walked into the office 5 minutes later, Morrison was shocked by what he saw. The man before him was thinner than Morrison remembered, grayer around the temples, wearing a simple sweater and slacks that suggested a teacher's salary rather than a cop's. But his eyes were the same, clear, direct, carrying the same moral certainty that had made him refuse to plant evidence 7 years earlier. "Hello, Bill." "Danny, please, sit down. Can I get you coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thanks." They sat across from each other, 7 years of silence stretching between them like an ocean of unspoken truths, broken promises, and irreversible choices. "I heard about Katie," Daniel said quietly. "Maria's sister works at Children's Hospital. She mentioned seeing you and Sarah there for appointments. I wanted you to know that our family has been praying for her." The simple kindness in Daniel's words hit Morrison like a physical blow. After everything that had happened between them, after all the pain and betrayal, Daniel's first concern was for Morrison's daughter. "Thank you. That means more than you know. I also wanted you to know that I'm leaving Denver next month. I got a job teaching high school history in Colorado Springs. Fresh start for the family." Morrison felt an unexpected pang of loss. Despite everything, Daniel had been his closest friend for 3 years, his partner in ways that went beyond professional collaboration. His betrayal of that friendship was perhaps the heaviest weight Morrison carried. "Teaching suits you. You were always good with people, good at explaining things. The kids are great. They remind me why I became a cop in the first place, to help people, to make a positive difference in the world." The implied criticism stung, but Morrison knew he deserved it. "Danny, about what happened 7 years ago." Daniel held up a hand. "I didn't come here to relitigate the past, Bill. I came to say goodbye, and to tell you something important." "What?" Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious but not angry. "I forgive you." Morrison stared at his former friend, certain he'd misheard. "What?" "I forgive you. For the theft, for framing Jenkins, for destroying his life, for ending my career. I forgive you. I don't understand. For 7 years I carried anger and resentment like stones in my chest. It was eating me alive, poisoning my marriage, affecting my relationship with Carmen. I realized that holding on to that anger was just giving you power over my life that you didn't deserve." Morrison felt tears burning his eyes. "Danny, I'm not saying what you did was okay. Steve Jenkins is dead because of choices you made. That's something you'll have to live with forever. But I won't let your choices continue to poison my life." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 7 years pressing down on both of them like the snow falling outside. "I think about him," Morrison whispered. "Jenkins. Every day." "Good. You should. I think about you too. About how things might have been different." Daniel stood to leave, pausing at the door. "They still can be, Bill. It's not too late to do the right thing." 18 years later, in March of 2013, Chief William Morrison sat in the sterile examination room at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, listening to Dr. Patricia Hendricks deliver the worst news of his life. "The tests confirm pancreatic cancer, Chief Morrison. Stage 4, I'm sorry." The words seemed to echo from far away, as if spoken in a dream. Morrison had gone in for routine blood work after weeks of fatigue and stomach pain, expecting to be told he needed to eat better and exercise more. At 59, he'd thought his biggest health concern was high blood pressure. "How long?" His voice sounded strange, detached. "Without treatment, perhaps 3 months. With aggressive chemotherapy, we might extend that to 8 or 9 months. But I have to be honest. Pancreatic cancer at this stage is very difficult to treat." Morrison stared at the medical diploma on the wall, trying to process the information. 8 months, maybe 9 if he was lucky. After 28 years of carrying secrets, time was suddenly a luxury he didn't have. "I'll need some time to discuss this with my family." "Of course, but Chief Morrison, I'd recommend starting treatment as soon as possible. Every day matters." On the drive home, Morrison found himself taking a detour through downtown Denver, past the police headquarters where he'd spent the last quarter-century climbing the ladder of success. In 6 months, he'd been planning to retire with full pension, maybe do some consulting work, spend time with his grandchildren. Now he was facing the possibility that he might not live to see Christmas. He pulled into the parking lot of Jefferson High School and sat watching teenagers stream out of the building at the end of the school day. Somewhere in that building, Daniel Rodriguez was teaching history to kids who had no idea their teacher had once been a police officer, that he'd sacrificed his career for principles they probably didn't even understand yet. Morrison hadn't spoken to Daniel since that day, 7 years earlier, when Daniel had come to say goodbye, but he'd kept track of him through mutual acquaintances and occasional internet searches. Daniel had become a beloved teacher, the kind of educator who inspired students to become better people. He'd won teaching awards, coached debate teams, sponsored volunteer programs. He'd rebuilt his life into something meaningful and good. Morrison, meanwhile, had spent 25 years climbing higher and higher in the police department, accumulating power and prestige while carrying the weight of Steve Jenkins' death and the knowledge that his success was built on a foundation of lies. That evening, Morrison sat in his study after dinner, staring at the photograph on his desk of Sarah and their 3 children. Katie, now 32, had overcome her learning disabilities to become a special education teacher. Their son Michael was a doctor in California. Their youngest, Jessica, was finishing her MBA. All successful, all proud of their father, the police chief, all unaware that his career had been purchased with stolen money and an innocent man's life. Sarah found him there an hour later, still holding the photograph. "Bill, you've been quiet since you got home. How did the appointment go?" Morrison looked at his wife of 34 years, the woman who had stood by him through every challenge, who believed in his integrity absolutely. Sarah had always been proud of being married to a police officer, proud of his reputation for honesty and fairness. The doctor found something on the tests, cancer. Sarah's face went white. "What kind? How serious?" "Pancreatic. Advanced." She sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk. "What does that mean? What are the treatment options?" Morrison explained what Dr. Hendricks had told him, watching his wife's world crumble with each word. When he finished, they sat in silence, holding hands across the desk. "We'll fight this," Sarah said finally. "Whatever it takes. The best doctors, experimental treatments, anything." Morrison nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Dr. Hendricks' words. Every day matters, not just for treatment, but for everything. For truth, for redemption, for the possibility of making amends before time ran out. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." She squeezed his hand. "What is it?" Morrison looked into her trusting eyes and lost his courage. "I love you. I've always loved you. No matter what happens, I want you to know that." "I know that, Bill. We're going to get through this together." But as Sarah planned appointments with oncologists and researched treatment options, Morrison was thinking about different kinds of battles. For 25 years, he'd fought to keep his secrets buried. Now, with time running out, he was beginning to wonder if the fight was worth winning. That night, unable to sleep, Morrison drove to the cemetery where Steve Jenkins was buried. The grave was simple, marked only with his name and dates. Stephen Michael Jenkins, 1962-1998. No epitaph, no mention of his service as a police officer. Morrison stood in the darkness looking down at the headstone and spoke aloud for the first time in 25 years about what really happened that night in November 1988. "I'm sorry, Steve. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I'm sorry. You were a good cop, a good man, and you died because I was a coward." The cemetery was silent, except for the wind in the trees. "I don't know if there's anything after this, but if there is, if you can hear me, I'm running out of time to make it right. I don't know if I'm brave enough to tell the truth, but maybe facing death will give me the courage I never had in life." Morrison knelt and placed a small American flag next to the headstone, then walked back to his car. As he drove home through the empty streets, he found himself thinking about Daniel Rodriguez's words from years earlier. It's not too late to do the right thing. Maybe not. But time was running out to find out. 6 months later, in October of 2013, Chief Morrison sat in his home office surrounded by documents he'd spent weeks gathering, police reports, evidence inventories, internal affairs files he wasn't supposed to have access to anymore. The chemotherapy had made him weak and nauseous, but it had also given him clarity about what needed to be done. Dr. Hendricks had been optimistic about his response to treatment. The tumors had shrunk slightly, buying him perhaps a few more months than originally projected. But Morrison knew he was living on borrowed time. Sarah knocked on the door and entered with a cup of tea. She'd taken leave from her teaching job to care for him, and the strain was showing on her face. "You've been in here for hours. What are you working on?" Morrison looked up at his wife, knowing that what he was about to do would destroy her image of him forever. "I'm writing a confession," Sarah laughed, thinking he was joking. "A confession to what? Being the most honest police chief in Denver history?" Morrison didn't smile. "Sarah, sit down. Please." Something in his tone made her face grow serious. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where they'd had countless conversations about his career, their children, their dreams for retirement. 25 years ago, I stole $500,000 from a drug seizure and framed an innocent man for the theft. That man went to prison and died there. My entire career, our entire life, has been built on that lie." Sarah stared at him in silence for a long moment, then shook her head. "No, that's not possible. You're the most honest man I know." Morrison opened a folder and pulled out photographs, bank records, documents he'd preserved for 25 years, like evidence against himself. "It's all here, Sarah. Everything. The theft, the cover-up, the frame job. I've been carrying this secret since before Katie was born." Sarah's hands trembled as she looked through the documents. Morrison watched her world collapse as she read bank statements, showing deposits that didn't match his salary, evidence logs with his handwriting, correspondence with lawyers about Steve Jenkins' case. "I don't understand. Why are you showing me this? Why now?" "Because I'm dying and I can't take this secret with me. Because an innocent man died in prison for something I did. Because Daniel Rodriguez lost his career for refusing to help me frame someone." "Daniel Rodriguez? Your partner? The one who was fired for insubordination?" "He was fired for having integrity, for refusing to plant evidence when I ordered him to." Sarah stood up suddenly, walking to the window with her back to him. Morrison could see her shoulders shaking. "The money we used for Katie's therapy, for Michael's medical school, for Jessica's wedding, where did it come from?" Morrison closed his eyes. "From my salary. I never touched the stolen money. It's been sitting in a safety deposit box for 25 years. Then why? Why risk everything? Why steal money you never even used?" "Because I was angry and greedy, and I thought I deserved more than what the city was paying me. And once I took it, I was trapped. I couldn't return it without admitting what I'd done, and I couldn't admit what I'd done without destroying everything we'd built." Sarah turned around, tears streaming down her face. "Everything we built was a lie. No. Our marriage is real, our children are real. The love we have for each other is real, but my career, my reputation, the respect people have for me, all of that is built on a lie. What are you going to do? Morrison gestured to the documents on his desk. I'm going to tell the truth publicly. I'm going to confess to everything. Bill, you'll go to prison. Even with the cancer, they could still prosecute you. I know. Our children will be humiliated. Your legacy will be destroyed. People will question every case you ever worked, every decision you ever made as chief. I know. Sarah sat back down, looking at her husband as if seeing him for the first time. And you're prepared for that. Morrison reached across the desk and took her hands. Sarah, for 25 years I've watched good officers work under my command, trusting my leadership, believing in my integrity. I've given speeches about honor and duty and doing the right thing, all while knowing I was a fraud. I can't die as a fraud. What about us? What about our family? You'll be okay financially. My pension, the life insurance, the house, it's all legitimate. It came from my real salary over the years. And maybe once the truth is out there, you'll be able to respect me again. Sarah was quiet for a long time, studying the man she'd been married to for 34 years. I've always respected you, Bill. Even now, knowing this, I can see how much it's been eating at you. You haven't been the same person since that night you came home so upset back in 1988. I always wondered what happened, but I never wanted to push. You knew something was wrong? Wives know, Bill. You started having nightmares. You became more distant, more driven to succeed. It was like you were trying to prove something to yourself. Morrison realized that his wife had been carrying her own burden all these years, the knowledge that something had changed in their marriage, the uncertainty about why her husband had become a stranger in some fundamental way. I'm sorry, Sarah, for all of it, for the lies, for the secrets, for putting you in this position. What do you need from me? Morrison was surprised by the question. He'd expected anger, recrimination, perhaps even rejection. Instead, his wife was asking how she could help. I need you to understand that this isn't about destroying our family. It's about trying to save what's left of my soul before I die. Sarah stood up and walked around the desk to where Morrison sat. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. Then do what you need to do. I'll stand by you just like I always have. That night, Morrison began writing his full confession. Not just the brief statement he'd planned for the press, but a detailed account of everything that had happened, including his own motivations and the broader implications for cases he'd worked on over the years. It would be the most important document he'd ever written, and quite possibly the last. As he wrote, Morrison found himself thinking about Daniel Rodriguez, wondering if his former partner would be watching when the truth finally came out. 25 years later, Daniel would finally be vindicated. It was the least Morrison could do, and far less than Daniel deserved. And so we returned to that packed auditorium at the Denver Community Center, where Chief Morrison finished reading his prepared statement. 200 people sat in stunned silence, processing the enormity of what they'd just heard. Television cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what would become one of the most shocking confessions in law enforcement history. Daniel Rodriguez remained motionless in his seat, his daughter Carmen gripping his hand tightly. At 32, she was seeing her father vindicated for the first time in her adult life, finally understanding why their family had struggled through her childhood. Questions? Morrison asked, though his voice was weak from the effort of reading his confession. Hands shot up throughout the auditorium. Reporters shouted questions over each other, creating a cacophony of voices that made individual words impossible to distinguish. Morrison pointed to a woman in the front row. Ms. Chen, Denver Post. Chief Morrison, why now? Why wait 25 years to tell the truth? Morrison gripped the podium, fighting a wave of nausea from his chemotherapy. Because I was a coward. Because I thought I could take this secret to my grave. But when you're facing death, you realize that some things are more important than protecting yourself. Another reporter stood. What about Officer Jenkins' family? What do you say to his widow, his son? Morrison's voice cracked. I say that I'm sorry, but I know that's not enough. Steve Jenkins died because of my choices. His family suffered because of my cowardice. There's no making that right, but maybe there's preventing it from happening again. A man in the back raised his hand. Chief Morrison, how do we know you're telling the truth now? How do we know this isn't another manipulation? Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Because I have documentation. Evidence I've preserved for 25 years. Bank records, photographs, correspondence, everything needed to verify what I'm telling you. He handed the envelope to Detective Lisa Morgan, now a deputy chief, who had been investigating the original case. Detective Morgan can verify the authenticity of these documents. Morgan took the envelope with shaking hands. She'd spent decades in law enforcement, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Another reporter called out, "What about the money, the $500,000? It's been sitting in a safety deposit box for 25 years. I never spent a penny of it. Detective Morgan has the key and the bank information. The money will be returned to the city." Daniel Rodriguez slowly stood up and the entire auditorium turned to look at him. Cameras swiveled in his direction as he made his way to the front of the room. Morrison watched his former partner approach, seeing in Daniel's face the same integrity that had made him refuse to plant evidence 25 years earlier. The years had been kind to Daniel in some ways. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had found peace with his choices. When Daniel reached the podium, he looked out at the crowd, then at Morrison. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel said into the microphone, "Chief Morrison asked me to say something, but I wasn't sure I would. 25 years ago, I lost my career for refusing to frame an innocent man. I lost my home, my financial security, my professional reputation." The auditorium was completely silent. For years I was angry, bitter. I couldn't understand how the system I'd believed in had failed so completely. How a good man like Steve Jenkins could die in prison while his real criminal was promoted and celebrated. Morrison closed his eyes, knowing he deserved every word. But as the years passed, I realized something. The system didn't fail. People failed. Individuals made choices, and those choices had consequences. Bill Morrison made bad choices 25 years ago, but today he's making a good choice. Daniel turned to look directly at Morrison. "Bill, I forgave you years ago. Not because you deserved it, but because carrying that anger was poisoning my life. Today you've shown more courage than you showed in all the years we were partners. Steve Jenkins can't be brought back, but his memory can be honored. His name can be cleared." Morrison felt tears streaming down his face. "Danny, You were right about one thing 25 years ago," Daniel continued. "I am exactly the kind of cop you used to be. Before you forgot who you were. Today, you remembered." The two men embraced as the crowd rose in thunderous applause. Flashbulbs popped, cameras rolled, and reporters frantically scribbled notes. When the noise finally died down, Morrison stepped back to the microphone. "There's one more thing I need to say. In my confession, I've documented every case that might have been compromised by my actions. Every arrest, every conviction, every piece of evidence that passed through my hands needs to be reviewed. Some convictions may need to be overturned. Some cases may need to be reopened." Deputy Chief Morgan stepped forward. "Chief Morrison, I'm placing you under arrest for theft of evidence, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." Morrison nodded and held out his hands for the handcuffs. As Morgan read him his rights, he looked out at the crowd one final time. "To every officer who served under my command, to every citizen who trusted me to protect and serve, to the family of Steve Jenkins, and to Daniel Rodriguez, I'm sorry. I failed you all. But maybe the truth can still serve justice, even when it comes 25 years too late." As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, the auditorium erupted in chaos. Reporters rushed for the exits, eager to file their stories. Cameras captured every moment of the historic arrest. Daniel Rodriguez stood at the podium, watching his former partner being led away. Carmen joined him, putting her arm around her father's shoulders. "Daddy, are you okay?" Daniel looked at his daughter, thinking about all the years of struggle, all the nights when he'd wondered if doing the right thing had been worth the cost. "Yes, sweetheart. I think I finally am." Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, covering Denver in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. 6 months later, in spring of 2014, the federal courthouse in downtown Denver was packed to capacity as Judge Patricia Williams prepared to deliver the sentencing decision that would close one of the most shocking corruption cases in Colorado law enforcement history. Former Chief William Morrison sat at the defendant's table, his once imposing frame now gaunt and fragile from months of aggressive chemotherapy, but carrying himself with a dignity he hadn't possessed in 25 years. The transformation in Morrison was remarkable to those who had known him during his years of professional success. The arrogance and defensive posture that had characterized his leadership style had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. His uniform had been replaced by a simple grey suit that hung loosely on his diminished frame, and his hands, once steady enough to qualify expert marksman, now trembled slightly from the medication that was buying him precious additional months of life. In the gallery behind him, Sarah Morrison sat with their 3 adult children, their faces showing the complex mixture of grief, shame, and love that had characterized their family's journey through the past 6 months. The media attention had been relentless, but they had weathered it together, united by their commitment to supporting the man who had finally found the courage to tell the truth. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Williams began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent 30 years on the bench dealing with the complexities of human nature, "you have pleaded guilty to charges of theft of federal evidence, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. These are serious crimes that strike at the very foundation of public trust in law enforcement institutions." Morrison stood slowly, his lawyer beside him for moral support rather than legal maneuvering. There had been no plea bargaining, no attempts to minimize his culpability. Morrison had insisted on pleading guilty to every charge, refusing to allow his terminal illness to be used as leverage for a reduced sentence. "However," Judge Williams continued, "the court also recognizes several mitigating factors. Your voluntary confession and complete cooperation with federal investigators, your terminal medical condition, and the fact that you never personally benefited from the stolen money. Taking all these factors into consideration, this court sentences you to 2 years supervised probation and 1,000 hours of community service." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Many observers had expected Morrison to receive prison time, despite his cooperation and medical condition. The judge's decision reflected the complex nature of a case where the defendant had committed serious crimes, but had also demonstrated remarkable courage in making them right. "Additionally," Judge Williams added, "you will forfeit all pension benefits accrued during your law enforcement career and must make full restitution to the city of Denver in the amount of $500,000 plus 25 years of accrued interest, totaling approximately $1,200,000. Morrison nodded his acceptance of the sentence. The financial penalty would leave his family in difficult circumstances, but the money had never truly belonged to them anyway. Sarah had already begun the process of selling their home and downsizing to a smaller apartment, approaching the financial challenges with the same grace she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. After the hearing, Daniel Rodriguez approached Morrison outside the courthouse steps, where a small crowd of reporters and photographers waited to capture what they sensed might be a final encounter between the former partners. "How are you feeling, Bill?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying genuine concern despite everything that had passed between them. Morrison managed a weak smile. "Physically? The cancer is winning the fight. But emotionally, Danny, I haven't felt this light in 25 years. It's like I've been carrying a 100-pound weight on my chest, and somebody finally helped me set it down." They walked together toward the parking structure, away from the media attention. 2 men in their 60s who had once been as close as brothers before choices and consequences had driven them apart for decades. "What will you do with the time you have left?" Daniel asked, as they paused near Morrison's car. "The community service assignment is interesting. Judge Williams wants me to work with at-risk youth, talking about the consequences of bad choices and the importance of integrity. Seems like appropriate penance." "It does." Morrison stopped walking and turned to face his former partner directly. "Danny, I know this doesn't change anything that happened, but I want you to know something. Watching you rebuild your life after I destroyed your career, seeing you become a teacher, and continue serving your community with dignity, it gave me hope that redemption was possible, even for someone like me. Redemption is always possible, Bill, for anyone willing to do the hard work of making amends." 6 months later, on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, William Morrison died at home in his sleep, surrounded by his family. His obituary in the Denver Post was a study in complexity, acknowledging both his years of distinguished service and his final admission of corruption, presenting him as neither hero nor villain, but as a flawed human being who had found the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. Daniel Rodriguez delivered the eulogy at Morrison's funeral, speaking to a congregation that included hundreds of police officers, city officials, and community members who had been touched by the extraordinary circumstances of his final confession. "Bill Morrison was my partner, my friend, and ultimately my adversary," Daniel said from the pulpit of St. Mary's Cathedral. "But in the end, he became something else entirely, an example of what it means to find moral courage when everything is at stake. Bill taught me that we're not defined by our worst mistakes, but by what we choose to do when we realize we've made them." Steve Jenkins was posthumously exonerated 8 months after Morrison's confession, his name officially cleared of all charges and added to the memorial wall honoring officers who had died in the line of duty. The ceremony was attended by his son Michael, now 45 and a successful architect, who had spent his entire adult life carrying the shame of his father's supposed corruption. "My father never got to see me graduate from college, never walked me down the aisle at my wedding, never met his grandchildren," Michael Jenkins said at the dedication ceremony. "But knowing that his name has been cleared, that people finally understand he was an innocent man who died for someone else's crimes, it means everything to our family and to his memory." The Denver Police Department implemented comprehensive reforms in evidence handling procedures, partially inspired by lessons learned from the Morrison case. A scholarship fund was established in Steve Jenkins' name to provide educational opportunities for children of police officers killed in the line of duty, funded entirely by private donations from officers who wanted to honor his memory. Deputy Chief Lisa Morgan, who had conducted the original internal affairs investigation 25 years earlier, was promoted to Chief of Police. In her first address to the department, she spoke about the fundamental importance of accountability at every level of law enforcement. "We are guardians of public trust," she told the assembled officers. "When we betray that trust, we harm not just ourselves but every honest officer who wears this badge, every citizen who depends on us for protection, and every family member who worries about our safety." The Morrison case reminds us that integrity isn't just a nice ideal. It's the foundation upon which all effective policing is built. Daniel Rodriguez retired from teaching at age 67, having spent 17 years inspiring high school students to think critically about ethics, justice, and personal responsibility. His classroom had become a laboratory for discussing real-world moral dilemmas, always returning to the principle that integrity is not negotiable, even when maintaining it comes at great personal cost. At his retirement party, former students shared stories about how his lessons had influenced their life choices. Many had become teachers themselves, others had entered law enforcement or public service, and all carried with them an understanding that doing the right thing sometimes requires great sacrifice. "Character isn't built in moments of comfort," Daniel told his students in his final class. "It's forged in the crucible of difficult choices, when doing what's right costs us something we value. Some people spend their lives covering up their mistakes. Others spend their lives making amends for them. The choice of which kind of person you become is always yours to make." Carmen Rodriguez, inspired by her father's story and her childhood memories of injustice, became a federal prosecutor specializing in public corruption cases. She often told colleagues that growing up with a father who chose integrity over security had taught her that justice was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. On the 26th anniversary of the night he was fired from the Denver Police Department, Daniel Rodriguez visited Steve Jenkins' grave at Riverside Cemetery. He brought fresh flowers and a small American flag, standing quietly for several minutes in the peaceful suburban cemetery where Steve's story had finally found its proper ending. "Steve," Daniel said quietly, "I know you can't hear me, but I wanted you to know that the truth finally came out. Your name is cleared. Your son knows you were innocent. It took 26 years, but justice finally happened." As Daniel walked back to his car, he reflected on the weight that Morrison had carried for 25 years, and the peace that had come from finally telling the truth. Some burdens are too heavy to bear forever, and some truths are too important to take to the grave. The evening sun cast long shadows across the cemetery as Daniel drove home to his family, grateful for a life built on principles that had never wavered, even when they had cost him everything he thought he wanted. In the end, integrity had proven to be the only treasure worth keeping, the only legacy that truly mattered.